Mr. Vice Chairman, you are welcome to call the meeting to order and proceed with the agenda.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Those who are here, I'd like to call the meeting to order. And we're going to start with the approval of the agenda.
Mr. Vice Chair, I'd like to make a motion. I move that we approve the agenda as given.
I'll second that.
So all in favor?
I
Thank you.
approve the approval of the agenda. Now we're going to move to the approval of the minutes.
Mr.
Anyone would like
Chairman,
to-
I move that we accept the minutes from the last meeting.
Okay.
And I accept. I'm second, I'm sorry.
Okay, well, we have approved the approval of the minutes. Now we're going to move on to old business. Well, do we need to read the minutes?
You're
Okay.
you're in good shape, Mr. Vice Chairman. We have no old business, so move right on to new business. I'd like to welcome Bahia Greer back with us, and she was there a moment ago. So welcome back, Bahia, and Bahia, we've got our report as it relates to the IDI that this group took in the city council. So we've asked her to do that assessment report. And so I'll turn it over to Bahia, and welcome back, Bahia.
Thank you. Thank you so very, very much for having me back. Good evening to everyone. I hope that everyone's had a very good holiday and new year. And I am very, very grateful that I'm able to come back and report on some of the data that we captured from your participation in last year's IDI assessment. Again, the IDI stands for the Intercultural Development Inventory. So I have a pretty large deck to share. I know some of the information we did actually go over last year when I presented the results from the administrator's assessment. And so some of that information may be familiar. And so for those familiar decks, I will kind of move through those a little faster so we can kind of get to the good stuff, which is what I'm sure most people want to know, which is your results, your group aggregate results. And for some people that have already had their one-on-one feedback call, again, some of this information may be familiar, but for others who did not have a chance to have a feedback call, this information will be very, very interesting. So moving forward, just to kind of set the tone, from October 31st to November the 7th of last year, we administered the IDI to 12 city council members. And in addition to responding to the set assessment questions, there were some additional demographically significant information that was provided. And we're going to share some of that information also to kind of set the tone for the results that we did have. So we had 12 IDIs disseminated. 11 of them were completed. So you see the completion rate. And then we had 6 city council members that availed themselves to feedback calls. So that explains the participation rate. And again, if there are any questions, because I can't see anyone's faces, if you have any questions at all on a slide, please just stop me and let me know, and I can certainly go back or spend more time on a particular slide. So those individualized feedback calls were opportunities for respondents to go over their results with a consultant one-on-one. Each call was about half an hour, where their report was read out. It was explained. Some of the more impactful components of the results were explained and discussed with each respondent. And just explaining again here on this slide that the full participation rate was dropped because of the number of council members who had feedback calls or selected to have feedback calls. I know we went over this a little bit briefly last year, but it's important for us just to kind of examine again what culture is and what culture is not. I oftentimes share with clients when we have these discussions about cultural situations or cultural environments. Culture is everything. Culture, people have various definitions of culture. Everyone here in the room has their own personal definition of what they think culture is when they think of the word. But oftentimes what gets lost is the understanding that every interaction we have, every environment that we find ourselves in is based in some type of cultural modality or cultural understanding and cultural expectation. And although if we have been enculturated, as the word is, or brought up in a particular environment where certain things just seem normative or they seem regular or they seem okay, and it just seems right and comfortable, then we oftentimes lose track of the fact that this is something that's culturally based and not just the way things are or the ways things should be. So a lot of what this particular assessment is meant to help us understand and track is how we interact in situations that are not as comfortable or familiar to us, and how much understanding we have about what is in fact culturally based and what is in fact something that was created by people, by groups. So let's talk about the spectrum in which we are rated on this particular assessment. This is the Intercultural Development Continuum, the IDC, and it moves between monocultural mindsets and intercultural mindsets. And again, the assessment is meant to track our placement along this particular spectrum. For those of us that subscribe to more of a monocultural mindset, we think of culture kind of just one thing. And oftentimes that one thing is the culture with which we have been raised in. For those of us that subscribe to a more intercultural mindset, we have an understanding of various different cultures. We have an understanding that there are various types of cultures, and it is that varied amount of cultural understanding and cultural application that makes for a different type of environment. So people may call it a better environment, a more inclusive world in many ways. But just leaving this up on the screen, are there any questions regarding the spectrum itself or the continuum itself? Moving from denial, polarization, minimization, acceptance, and adaptation. And it's also important to note that our results are going to land on one of these places. As an individual, if you had a feedback call, you would have gotten your individualized results to know where you are as a person. What we're going to discuss this evening are the averages of all the city council members who sat for this particular assessment. So you're going to get the group aggregate results of where the group falls along this particular spectrum. This particular slide showcases where most people who sit for the assessment fall. Most individuals. And when we say most individuals, we're talking about most individuals based within the United States. So you see that it kind of works as a bell curve. We have a smaller group of people that are in denial and denial is monocultural. And we have a small group of people who are in adaptation. And adaptation is the furthest you can get to an intercultural perspective. And then everyone else kind of just falls in the middle. And so as we go over the group aggregate results, it might be interesting just to kind of track where most people find themselves. Two things that this particular assessment also tracks, and this again is something that we talked about last year. It tracks how we think we show up in situations that are unfamiliar or even uncomfortable to us. And that is called the perceived orientation, how we think we behave in those situations. This assessment also tracks how we actually show up in situations that are uncomfortable or unfamiliar to us. And that is called the developmental orientation, how we actually behave. And when we get our results, our group aggregate results, it's going to showcase how the group perceives it is in situations of cultural unfamiliarity, and it's also going to show how the group actually shows up. And the difference between how we think we behave or show up versus how we actually show up is called the orientation gap. And that's going to be showcased by a number. I always share with clients, not to get too wrapped up in what the size of that number, if it's a small number or a large number. What it really speaks to is our blind spots, our cultural blind spots. And it's better really for us to examine what those blind spots may be and how they might actually show up in our day-to-day interactions and our interactions as a group. So let's look at some group aggregate results. Okay. So first, we're going to get into some demographic information. And this may feel very familiar because this is, again, a snapshot of who we are. I'm going to move some things around so I can see this better. Okay. So our educational level, I'm not sure if it's surprising to any of us. Are you able to see the entire slide, even down to where it says master's degree?
But yeah, we can't see the percentage under master's, but we can see master's degree.
Oh my. Well, that is not good. Okay. It says 40%. If you could bear with me, what I would like to do, because we have a lot of this to share, if this is already becoming a problem, I'm going to, okay, there we go. All right, and so moving to the next one, organizational profile. Anything about how we have defined ourselves? Because again, all this is self-selected by those who have sat for the IDI. How we see ourselves, how we define ourselves, how we view ourselves as part of this particular work is really, really important because it really does inform how we see ourselves, informs how we see the world. How we see ourselves informs how we see others. And so it's really important for us to first examine how we see ourselves. Our age. And as we kind of filter through these various demographic slides, it's interesting to see how the circle graphs change. If there's a lot of disparity between the colors, or are there larger swaths or sections? And all of that also informs how we think en masse as a group. It's interesting to note that this is the only circle graph that looks like this. And what's also interesting to note is of all of the various demographic questions that were asked and provided, there was often an opportunity to choose prefer not to answer. This was the only demographic question where there were people chose not to answer. And that even is interesting enough for conversation. Maybe not today, or maybe not at this venue, but it's just interesting for us to kind of think. Because a lot of questions were asked of us, and we kind of pick and choose what we want to move forward with and provide, and things that we'd rather not share. Okay. Any additional questions about our demographics?
I have a question. This
Please,
is
go ahead.
only the city council? It's
Yes,
not this
this-
council as well.
I'm sorry.
This is only the city council. It does not include this committee at all.
I think it does. It is this committee, the 7 members on this committee and the 5 members on the city council. So those are the 12.
Thank you. Thank you.
And thank you for clarifying that. Thank you. Okay, well, let's get into the numbers. So we talked about, again, perceived orientation versus developmental orientation. Our perceived orientation is how we think we show up. And so we think we show up within the acceptance orientation. And kind of going back to what acceptance is for those of us that may remember from last time, but definitely going to showcase it again this evening. The acceptance orientation is an orientation that is very open and welcoming and knowledgeable about cultural difference. The acceptance orientation is an orientation that sees the nuanced differences between cultures, even cultures that reside within the same country or continent or environment. I remember remarking to my husband, because I'm originally from North Carolina, but I moved to Mississippi, and I told him, oh, well, moving to Mississippi, that's easy because I'm a Southerner. And he said, no, Mississippi is a different type of Southern. Right. If you are attuned to acceptance orientation, you would understand the difference between the South and the Deep South. And it's not just all the South. Now, conversely, our developmental orientation is within minimization. And we're going to spend a lot more time this evening talking about minimization. But it's important to note that minimization is a little further back than acceptance is on the spectrum. That's the first thing to state. A lot of people in minimization are trying to get to acceptance. Minimization focuses more on the universality of people in groups and the commonalities and similarities of people in groups. And minimization really, those of us within minimization sometimes have a harder time looking for and acknowledging the nuances between different. So going back to the analogy of the Deep South versus just the South, someone within minimization would just kind of focus on, oh, well, it's all Southern. It doesn't really make a difference. Let's just focus on that, as opposed to focusing on differences between the two. Any initial questions? Oh, and then again, our orientation gap. Looking at the number, that is, in fact, the number. Again, it's more important for us to focus on what the blind spots may be, because again, this particular slide it helps us understand that there are gaps between how we see ourselves and how we actually may interact. Any questions before we move forward? All right, so this is the spread. For all of the council members who, again, sat for this particular assessment, no one was in adaptation, which is the most intercultural of the mindsets, of the orientations. No one was in acceptance. A sizable number of us were within minimization. Then quite a few of us, almost 40%, were in polarization, and then no one was in denial. So we're going to spend most of our remaining time this evening on this deck talking about minimization and polarization and what they are and how it may, and then really I would love to hear comments or thoughts or responses on how we think it may show up for us as individuals, as council members, as community members, as residents. There's always a story, right? So let's examine polarization first. It's important to note the polarization is more of a evaluative mindset. Those of us in polarization oftentimes view culture as a us versus them versus us type scenario. And polarization can take two different forms. For defense, for those of us that are in the defense part of polarization, we oftentimes may think that our cultural practices are a bit superior to other cultures. And cultural differences are kind of seen as divisive or threatening to our way of doing things or our way of life. And oftentimes those of us in polarization, especially the defense section of polarization, may view cultural difference as a challenge to, oftentimes you hear the term, our way of life. And we will sometimes hearken back to the way things used to be and how we wish things were like that at one time. For those of us in polarization that adopt more of a reversal form of polarization, we actually advance and view and value other cultures as superior to ours. And oftentimes we will idealize other cultures while denigrating our own culture. And so we'll say things like, maybe those people over there, they really, those people in that country, they really know how to take care of their parents. We've lost our way. We don't take care of our elderly anymore in our culture. Or think of other ways in which our culture is just not viewed as good or as valuable or as worthy as other practices in other cultures. Often, in some cases, those of us in polarization, and especially the reversal form, we may kind of pick up the mantle of other causes in other countries, thinking that we are amplifying or supporting or just being a good person by bringing attention to the great practices of another country or another culture, but not really trying to understand that other country or that other culture. And we do it as a way of really kind of just bringing attention to a particular cultural practice. Oh, I'm sorry, and this is not shown. When polarization is present in environments, oftentimes diversity feels uncomfortable. And sometimes we may see that shown in like resistance to the examination of cultural practices, or resistance to examination of cultural understanding or cultural work in general. So this is polarization. And then this little graph here is meant to kind of showcase some of the practices that are and the actions that we often find with those of us that subscribe to the polarization orientation. I'm going to leave this on the screen for a moment just for us to look at. Okay, now looking over, because I'd love to just open the floor up to any first blush questions that may come up. Does anyone have any initial questions about polarization?
Bahia, this is John. Knowing the results from our administrative group, I believe that it's interesting to me, and maybe you can talk about it, that this group of 12 individuals is much, much more diverse from race and gender than our group of administrative folks. And it's interesting that the polarization level is higher than our group. Is that pretty common? I mean, I guess my initial thought is there would be less polarization from a more diverse group than a more homogeneous group. Does that make sense at all?
Oh, it does. It does. And I love the fact that you brought in some of the data from the administrators, and you're spot on, John. So yes, what's interesting to note is that the administrative group is a lot more, it's clearly more homogeneous. And not only did the administrators have a lower rate of polarization, but there was a sizable group of individuals that were in acceptance. So quite a few, I think closer to almost a quarter of the individuals from the administrative group were in acceptance. So they were above minimization and even further along along the spectrum, where there was unfortunately no one here from this group in acceptance. But back to your question, sometimes I think that we oftentimes think that with variety of presenting diversity, I always do it like that. Like a person's gender is an example of a presenting identity. That's what's called gender expression oftentimes, right? Gender and the gender expression. A person's race is another example of a presenting identity. It's what's often presented to the world, and oftentimes it can still be different from how you see yourself, right? Oftentimes we think that if we're looking at a group, or there is a group with a lot of presenting varied presenting identity, then that must mean that that group holds itself to be more welcoming to particular cultural differences, or more accepting of cultural variety. And that's just not necessarily true. And if I could even use an example. So, and this is something that I think may ring true for what we're experiencing in Hendersonville, and then what people are experiencing in many, many other towns and cities and locales throughout the United States. So if I live in a community that has historically looked a certain way, my neighbors all look like me. We can get along, we talk, I know the people next door. There is a very great and strong sense of neighborliness and community along my street. And then others start moving into my street, and they start moving into my block. And my neighbors don't look like my old neighbors as before. And I might begin to resent that. And there are a lot of different terms that we have for that when neighborhoods begin to change economically, racially, culturally. We use terms like gentrification, right? We use terms like economic turnover. But some of the things that come out of that or expressed in that is in the left top hand corner of the screen. A strong commitment to one's own cultural view of the world is shown in defense. I would love it if the people that look like me could kind of stay in my neighborhood. I resent the fact that people that don't look like me are moving into the neighborhood. I like the culture that was here before. I don't like this new culture. And it doesn't have to be a culture, us versus them versus people who live in the United States and someone lives abroad. It could be us versus them, someone that lives on your street corner and someone who lives on the other side of Hendersonville. That's a different culture over there, and this is my culture here. How does that,
Thank you.
does that make
That's-
sense at all?
It does. It's helpful for me. Thank you.
Yeah. Any additional questions about polarization and how it shows up? It may show up. I think it's important for us to understand that none of the orientations along the spectrum are value judgments on how any of us behave, how any of us think, how any of us interact. It's not meant, this is why we take a lot of time and even the language that we choose and not calling this a test. This is not a test. There's no one being graded on this. It's an assessment because it's meant to help us understand, kind of like a doctor's checkup. You know, you go in and check your levels, and you want to see, are you working at is your body working at its most optimum level for performance? And oftentimes we're asking ourselves, are our interactions the best interactions and the best perspective and the best way of viewing the world that serves us in the best way as individuals, and then obviously as greater bodies. So if we move from polarization to minimization, where about 63% of us found ourselves, minimization is kind of in the middle, right? Between the monocultural orientations and the more intercultural, global orientations. Again, minimization really speaks more to the commonalities. And I love the fact that it talks a little bit about human similarity, like the basic needs, versus the more universal principles. So I'll use an example. Those of us in minimization may highlight commonalities in basic needs, like everyone needs to eat. All human beings need to take in some sustenance to survive, right? And that's a commonality that we all share. But, and also minimization, we may highlight universal principles, like every parent wants their child to get a good education. Now, that's not a basic need to get a good education, but it's a universal principle that those of us in minimization oftentimes will subscribe to. And what's interesting is, because it doesn't sound bad on its face, right? All parents want their child to get a good education. The problem is when we begin to act upon that, and we begin to subscribe to a belief that in fact is an absolute. And the way that people practice this universal principle is an absolute. So I'll follow up with this example. All parents want their child to get a good education. Therefore, all parents should have their child enrolled in primary school. They shouldn't homeschool their child. All parents want their children to get a good education. So therefore, if a child misses too many days or they're truant for too many days from school, they're not a very good parent. Does it kind of make sense how we can take a universal principle and then create a very absolute way of practicing or viewing that particular principle? And that's really essentially minimization. And it also takes two forms, like polarization does. Minimization can highlight a commonality due to our limited cultural self-understanding. And sometimes we do find this to be more heavily experienced by dominant group members within a cultural community. So what does all that mean? That means that if I live in an environment where I'm a member of the dominant culture, and that can manifest itself in so many different ways, I may have a hard time understanding people from other cultures. Why? Because everyone around me shares my cultural values and beliefs, and everyone around me practices the culture in the same way that I do. And everyone that they know practices the culture the same way that I know. So it's very difficult for me to understand, and I will have a limited understanding of other people whose cultures are even either vastly different from mine or even nuancedly different from mine. The other way that minimization comes about is it highlights the commonalities. So a member of the non-dominant culture oftentimes will try to highlight commonalities as a strategy to navigate the values and practices by the dominant group. So if a person of the non-dominant culture is coming into my community and they want to be a successful contributing member of society, of this new community, they're going to lean on things that make sense to them. And oftentimes the things that make sense to them are going to be universal values and principles or larger scale commonalities. Like, okay, well, I'm new to this culture and I really don't like the food, but you know, everyone eats bread, right? So I'll just focus on the bread, even if I'm not really attuned to some of the other stuff that they have on the table. Or I come into this new culture, I don't really understand the language, but everyone smiles and people can kind of understand what I'm saying from my facial expressions. And because everyone expresses themselves some way, right? And so that's what I focus on. It's also important to note that sometimes this can have a survival value for people and from the non-dominant culture moving into the dominant culture, because they need also to not just thrive, but survive in an environment. And so they will focus on larger scale commonalities. And when minimizing, this is, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, do you think that might be a factor in the results you presented last time, and that group may not have that survival piece as much as a more diverse group such as ours? And meaning that we have a larger, sorry, I'm trying to see if I can reword what I'm trying to say. That minimization is larger in our group because we have that survival or that survival experience is maybe more represented in our group since it's more diverse of being people of color in a majority white community versus the administrative group that was more homogeneous and didn't have that survival experience as much.
I think that is such a insightful way of looking at it. And absolutely, I think it's larger in this particular group for both of these two ways, for the survival on clause B, and also quite possibly for various individuals, right? Because everyone has their individual result. Maybe there are members of our group that are members of a dominant culture. And I always want to underscore, because oftentimes we kind of default to race. We default to race. It's not always about, race is not the only identifier that makes us a member of the dominant culture in many ways, which is why it was so important for us to kind of go through those all 8 of those slides, right? For us to see ourselves, and looking at those circle graphs, looking at the age, you could see where you were, right? As an individual. looking at the race, looking at gender, looking at sexual orientation, looking at length of time living in Hendersonville, we could all see ourselves in those graphs, and we could see, am I a member of the dominant culture? Or am I not a member of the dominant culture? And oftentimes we're going to find ourselves a member of the dominant culture in at least half of those graphs. And so if someone else is coming in, or someone's a member of our group, or someone's a member of the council, and they're not a member of the dominant culture for that particular identity, and let's say we're having a discussion on an issue within the city that really rests on someone's knowledge and experience on this particular thing. If I'm a member of the dominant culture, I'm going to look at this law, this presumed law, or I'm sorry, this suggested law very differently than someone from the non-dominant culture would look at it. And it informs and is very impactful on how we govern. It definitely is how we govern. But I love the fact that you brought that in, and I think, yeah, again, very insightful. That may be one of the reasons that if we're going to compare the two groups, why minimization is so large and overwhelming in this particular group. Additional thoughts or comments on minimization, or this particularly?
I think it helps. I mean, from my position, it helps me change how I think about this whole IDI and what the perspectives of both groups, right? Of both groups, it changes. And I think that's Nancy, it's a great question. It's really got me thinking about, I think it's very insightful. I appreciate that. And the fact that being a white male in America, my perspective absolutely is going to be totally different than someone else. So I think that's it's helps break down stereotypes, I think.
Hey, Bahia, this is
Yeah.
Lindsay. And I'm gonna go backwards because
Okay.
based on what Nancy just said. So for my personal results, I was shocked to find myself in polarization, but I was in reversal. And I would be curious to know, because we had such a high amount of people that were in polarization, if a lot of us were in reversal because we have an issue, like other cultures are better than mine because my culture doesn't value people of color or people that are not straight, and I feel like that's what's got me stuck in polarization. And because of the diversity in the group, is it the same sort of thing for us that are stuck in polarization? Is it because we're stuck in that reversal because we're mad at our own culture? I don't know, it totally floored me when I got mine.
Right, because and I appreciate your honesty and vulnerability with sharing your results, which I think is great, right? Because we're only going to learn if we share. Like, the numbers are the numbers, right? So it's just good for us to kind of just say, like, okay, well, these are my results, and this is how I felt about it. What we often find is that, especially in moments of our history where there is so much social upheaval and so much discontent with elements of our society, we will find like stronger results of people who are just mad or angry or frustrated with how they view their environment. And so, yes, like, we're picking up the mantle, we're saying other people will do it better. I need to go to Switzerland because, people can live a free life there and we can't live a free life here, all kinds of stuff. Right. And so, yes, but the challenge with polarization, even though it doesn't make you a bad person, obviously, what the challenge with for anyone being in polarization is, even if you may be a very well-meaning individual and you may see the world very different than someone maybe like in denial that just kind of eschews cultural difference discussions and doesn't want to talk about diversity and all that muckety muck. The challenge with us staying in reversal is that we are still taking an evaluative stance on cultures. We're still kind of locked in this continuous dance where we're comparing one group to another group. And if we're oftentimes just looking at the comparisons between groups, we're not able to see the nuanced differences of those groups, which is why this is really a spectrum, because if we can break ourselves out of the comparison of those groups, then we move on to the next stage, which is minimization, which looks at the commonalities of those groups. And then we can break ourselves out of that and look at the next stage, which is where we can appreciate the differences. Love the commonalities, but still appreciate the differences. And we move further and further up the spectrum. Does that, how does that feel in terms of a response? And I really would like to know what you think as well, because you're not the only person in polarization that's in the room.
I was surprised just because of like, and it was the same sort of thing. So our perceived is acceptance, which is where my perceived was. And so it almost makes me feel a little bit better that there's quite a few people in our group that are also in polarization.
All good people, yes.
Because I imagine that all of us probably thought that we were further along the spectrum than that. So no, what you're saying makes a lot of sense. So thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Yep. This is Nancy. I am with you, Lindsay. I was like, oh my goodness, so what is wrong with me? But it really helped in that call when we talked about minimization and for people of color or for folks of the non-dominant group, kind of using that as a coping mechanism for survival. I was like, okay, that makes sense. And then also for people of a non-dominant group kind of minimizing their own very, very different identity as a means to fit in or as a means to be able to relate to people around them. I was like, okay, this is like a product of my environment, as it's full circle, as Bahia mentioned at the beginning when we were talking about culture. So this is not a reflection of us, but also our environment. Because I could be living in a completely different place where I was in the dominant group and the result could be different, perhaps.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. Yeah, the two, some of the most impactful things that we see with minimization, and those of us in minimization, is that yes, those of us within this orientation, we try to avoid stereotyping and we want to treat everyone just kind of as an individual, and we love differences, and let's go to let's go to a parade and let's go to an event and let's learn about other cultures. And I value a person for their humanity. I don't value them for their race or their gender. And these are all laudable, wonderful, valuable things for us, and aspirational things for us to stand on. One of the challenges with minimization, which you may see as you kind of meander kind of clockwise up the screen, is that we will oftentimes kind of, because we are so focused on the humanity of everyone, we will put a lot of people in that bucket of humanity and a lot of different characteristics in that bucket of humanity, where maybe they deserve to be kind of just examined on their own. And so we will subscribe to these larger beliefs or ideologies of people being kind of like us, like, hey, everybody wants a safe place to live, right? That makes sense. I don't think anyone in this room would disagree that, someone desires to live in an unsafe environment. And again, going back to like these grand statements, right? Of, everyone wants to educate their children. Everyone wants to do this, and those are beautiful statements to make. But as soon as we start kind of turning the corner and actualizing those statements, that's when it becomes problematic, because we paint people with the same brush. We've done a lot of work with primary school educators with this, some of because a lot of us find ourselves in minimization orientation, right? And we talked about why so many of us do, but I'll get back to that in a second. But we do a lot of work with primary school educators on minimization orientation. Even when we talk about truancy issues, why is this child not in school? Oh, well, they must be a bad parent, or they don't value education of their child. And not even trying to take a moment and think about, there may be some culturally learned behaviors or culturally learned expectations at play here that we're not noticing. And maybe that child needs to help their parent out and work for the week, and the parent has to take the child out of school. Is it for us to determine that that person is a bad parent because they pulled their child out of school? And so we spend a lot of time thinking about that. And I would love for us to kind of examine as city council members and as servants of the city itself, when there are discussions and there are contemplations, greater contemplations about the direction of where we want the city to go. What perspective are we using? Are we making grand statements and are we attributing grand belief systems based off of our own experience or kind of these universal principles of what we think should apply? Are we looking things differently? Going back to the comment about minimization orientation being used as a coping strategy for non-dominant culture members. Oftentimes we see this continuously. We see it in work, in places of work, places of social interaction. If a person wants to be able to survive and thrive in an environment, they're going to do all they can to try to go along and get along with that environment. I oftentimes use the example of I identify as a woman, right? And if I'm working in an environment and I'm surrounded by men, I'm a member of the non-dominant culture. Or if all the guys in my environment come in on Monday talking about football games from the previous night, from Sunday night, it might be helpful for me if I want to get into the conversation to learn the lingo, right? So now I'm learning about the power I and what the, how to read a defense and stuff that I may not have really cared about before, but now I'm trying to learn that so I can be a part of the group and be a part of this established community. One of the unintended consequences of that is that I may minimize aspects of my own identity. Maybe I really don't like football, but I'm learning about it and I'm learning the language and the culture of football so that I can be a part of this culture at work, so that I can thrive in the workplace. And maybe that's more of a superficial example, but we have so many examples. And I'm sure that anyone here in the room tonight can attest to an example either in their own life or something they've observed with someone else. Any other thoughts or comments about minimization? Okay. Well, the last,
I have one.
oh,
Sorry.
please go ahead. Please.
And the may not be fully aware of how one's ideas and behaviors are culturally grounded. I think that also speaks to how we're raised in school, like learning things through the lens of like the white eye, for example, or very whitewashed education. And so folks in non-dominant groups might not have the opportunity to reflect on their own culture as well, to be aware of how that is reflected in their ideas and behaviors. That was really badly worded, but I hope at least a little bit came through.
You were very eloquent with that. No, you hit it. You hit it spot on. And how do we actually see that? How does that oftentimes manifest itself? With ideologies that support the right way of doing things, or ideologies that perpetuate an idea that there's a proper way of us either behaving or thinking or acting. All of that comes from someplace, right? And I know that I shared in the last session when we talked about the results from the administrators about truly what culture is. And culture, again, is the four walls that raised you. So the people that taught you how to tie your shoe and to wash your hands after you use the bathroom and all those things, that is in fact your culture. And when you walk and we leave our homes and we go to work and we interact with people, oftentimes we don't understand that even the color of the seat that you're sitting in was selected by a person. The seat that you came and sat in tonight was selected by a person. And that person was under the belief that that color of that chair or bench was a proper color to put into a legislative building or a building that would be used for that purpose. They didn't pick pink polka dots or some kind of like cheetah print. They chose a particular color, a type of fabric. All of this, even the structure and the layout of the room, is culturally grounded. It comes from a place. And what you see here in this room and the order of this particular legislative body and room is not practiced universally in other places, in other cultures, other people. It's not arranged in the same manner. But we take it oftentimes for granted because we think, okay, well then, this is how it's done. And the moment someone comes in and chooses the zebra print for the seats, we have a problem. Not that it affects the way we sit in the chair, but we still have a problem. And why is that? So for the last thing I'd love for us just to kind of think about or consider and contemplate is, now that we have information about how we show up en masse as a group, how is my perceived orientation reflected in how I present myself in cultural environments? And again, I use the term cultural environments, but all environments are cultural environments because all environments are based in some type of cultural ideology. Without putting a value on whether it's right or wrong, it's still based on culture. How do we think our developmental orientation, again, that speaks to how we actually show up. How do we think our developmental orientation informs how we respond in uncomfortable or unfamiliar situations? So our developmental orientation, by and large, was minimization. For some of us, it was polarization. How does that inform how we actually show up in uncomfortable, unfamiliar situations? If we're in polarization, we may take the defense and say, oh, you know, my culture is not that great, other cultures are great. Or we may say, my culture is wonderful, other cultures are terrible. Or if we're in minimization, it may come up for us and wanting to just kind of focus on what we all have in common. Why can't we all just get along and focus on our shared values? Whatever that means, right? What are our shared values? And then finally, how does our developmental orientation inform how I receive or how I perceive other people? My developmental orientation of minimization or polarization, how does that inform how I receive other people? How do I view them? How do I treat them, really? Receive really speaks to how I treat them. And then how I perceive them is what I think of them. So would anyone like to share their thoughts or reflections in the response to any of these questions?
But I'll be vulnerable for a minute since Nancy was vulnerable. Thinking about this, even though I wasn't part of this group, as it relates to, I'll tell you a quick story. And this has been 10 or 15, this has been over 10 years ago, probably 15 years ago. Something that I didn't even think about, as it relates to my perceived orientation, and, where I am as it relates. I'm a minimalist, by the way. So I'm not as evolved as I thought I was. But interesting time, I was speaking to a group of young, frankly, a young group of young African-American males. It was kind of a civics lesson kind of thing. And I brought up the idea of, that people had fought and died for the freedoms that were granted to us by by the Declaration of Independence and ultimately the Constitution of the country and those kind of things. And I left that room thinking I had given this great civics lesson, but then I started thinking about the ancestors of those young African-American males would not have had the freedom that we had in 1776 or 1781 or whenever. They was not until 1865 or later, or even in this case now, still fighting for many of those things. So I have this perceived orientation of how evolved I was and educated at that time, and realized I was really embarrassed with myself that I didn't take that into consideration. I don't know if that just shows perception versus, developmental orientation, and how we may be perceived and perceive our knowledge. So I just think that's part of this whole conversation as we go through. And I think that's why Nancy's comment kind of hit home with me with what she said. So I just thought I'd share that.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, John. That's really impactful. And that is part of this process. That's why this particular assessment, I'm so grateful that so many people participated in kind of examining ourselves, because even though a lot of us may not think of ourselves as members of the dominant culture one way or another, if you're a city council member, you're in a position of dominance. Period. There's only so many in the city, right? And either you are one or you're not one. And so other people that are not council members may perceive you as being a person and a member of the dominant culture, not because based off of plurality, because there's a lot of people, but based off of the perceptions of power that you wield and influence that you wield. And so just even acknowledging that influence and that power, it's really important for us to think about, okay, I know I have this influence, I know I have this power. Now let me examine how I perceive the world based off of what I've been taught, what I've experienced, my own personal opinions on things, and do what I can to make sure that the perceptions that I carry into the work that I do as a servant of the city is best serves the needs and the desires of as many residents and community members as possible. Allison helped me with that term today. We were working on some language, shifting from residents to community members. Yeah. So, any other thoughts or comments before I say thank you?
Yeah, this is Melinda. As a Black female, I still feel somewhat uncomfortable in some situations. And I often wonder how people, how perceived to be to others. Are they welcoming, or after I leave the room, do they think of me as being not as tactful as they think I should have been? Or do they perceive me as being a weak-minded person? So I struggle with that sometimes as a woman, and especially as a Black woman. I don't think other cultures take us serious when we approach them about situations. They're patronizing, say, okay. And then when you're at the door, it's totally different. So that's what I'm struggling with, even within my own race.
Can you talk about that for a second?
Well,
Can you expand on that?
In the position that I'm in as a community leader in NAACP, there's some in my own race who think that, oh, she's uppity, she knows it all. And then there's some say, well, why should I go to her? She can't do anything for me because she's part of that dominant culture. So trying to communicate within my own culture to let them know, hey, no, we're in this together. Just because I may live on one side of town and you live on the other, or I may be part of another group that you're not, doesn't mean that I still don't feel the pain that you feel and the suffering. It's just hard to get that across.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much, Melinda. I would love to know if other members of your colleagues on the council, did they know that about you? Did they know that sometimes you struggle with these various, because you carry multiple identities, right? Like we all do. And you're getting it from both ends. Did you have colleagues that knew this already about you?
I'm sure they didn't. They don't know this because I'm good at hiding my inner feelings. You know, smiling faces don't always tell the truth, smiling faces. So I can look at you with a smile and probably fuming or hurting on the inside.
That's a coping strategy though, right?
You know?
It's a coping strategy. Oftentimes exhibited by non-dominant culture members, right? Because you have to be able to get through environments. You can't always just show exactly how you're feeling and articulate it to other people.
Because I don't want to come on to some people as an angry Black woman. You know?
It's an angry Black woman, right?
You know, that's the way some perceive us. If we start to assert ourselves, we're the angry Black woman. So kind of withhold all of those emotions until you're alone. And it's like, okay, I'll kick the chair across the room and be done with it. But that's just my personal struggle, is how I can get
That's
over this.
interesting.
Yeah.
It may be your personal struggle, but I would hazard to guess that there are other members on the committee who share similar challenges, not the same, but similar challenges in their inability to, or their challenge with the multi intersectionality of their identities and how it affects how they perceive others, how they're perceived by others.
100%.
And how you maybe even how you govern. Because if you make a ruling or a decision on something, someone may perceive you as not being on their side for a particular reason, right? Or being on their side for a particular reason. You're going to vote this way because you are XYZ.
True. Thank you.
Yeah. Any additional thoughts or comments before I close out, before I leave? I'll take this. I'll stop screen sharing.
It's good to know that we're all in the same boat.
Yeah. A lot of this particular work and this data that we, again, all being completely confidential, we just have the aggregate results. A lot of the work on the levels, really that's all we're paying attention to, the levels of minimization, the levels of polarization, the levels of denial or acceptance. We will, you're going to see more of this in the workshops that we'll be putting together later in the year, or that hopefully you'll be participating in later in the year, for us to do more work around how to move ourselves out of one place to another place. So that concludes my presentation for this evening. So.
Yeah, thanks, Bahia. One final question. Eric Gash is watching by Zoom, and I told him he couldn't participate because we're not using Zoom as part of but he wanted to listen to, but Eric made a point that, and it refers to what Melinda was saying about, I believe it's a survival mechanism because we only get one shot most of the time. And I think if I hear what Eric's saying, it's, as a member of the non-dominant culture, you got to make that first impression. There's only one time to make that first impression. I think that goes to what Melinda said. And he also said that once we're in the space, we have to adapt so we get a favorable decision. So those kind of things.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for the time, and thank you for the discussion. And of course, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to reach out via email or phone, or call me anytime. And I look forward to seeing everyone when we return back to Hendersonville. So, all right, take care.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay. Thank you. I thought that was good information, and we've done all the IDI, so all that will be put together as we develop our strategic plan and move forward with the focus groups, which is what she's working on now. So, just quick update. Nancy asked for an update regarding the comprehensive plan. We are just about getting ready to start that. We've hired the consultant. So this spring, we'll be putting together really community focus groups and community input sessions for folks as it relates to hear about comprehensive plan. And this is around planning and zoning and those kind of things. So that'll be coming up. And I think the question Nancy asked is, how can this group encourage participation from diverse segments of our community? And I don't want to put words in your mouth, Nancy, so I'll stop right there and let you.
Yeah, and also just how to make how we can support in making the process equitable across the board. So not only engagement from everyone, but also accessibility, like things in different languages, or disseminating information in ways that are accessible to everyone. Other ways that we can be a resource to the council or planning or whatever departments are involved in the process, to make sure that there is no question that this was the most inclusive and the most accessible process possible. Mhm.
Sure. Yeah, I will definitely pass that along. And I think it's good for us to hear from a staff perspective of the interest of this group, and to make sure that for you to continue to remind us to think outside the box and to look at all segments of our community, make sure we're reaching out to them. So thank you for that. And I'll pass it on to our community development staff as well as our consultant to make sure we're doing those kind of things. And so, is that good?
Sounds great.
Thanks. And similarly, Mr. Vice Chairman, question regarding discussion regarding mobility issues in downtown Hendersonville. We had a presentation at a city council meeting. Time flies. It should have been November or December, I think, is when that presentation was made, Councilmember Simpson. And I think the way we're approaching that is to do our public works department as well as our downtown. I don't know if it's been brought back to the downtown committees yet, but I know our public works department is responsible for ADA compliance and those kind of things. So that information is being shared. There hasn't been a lot of activity on that yet, but it is definitely something we took to heart and we'll be considering as we go forward. It's interesting that you brought this up because, we're starting to place the kiosk for the parking kiosks that are going up, and there's a lot going on in our sidewalks in downtown. And so it's a constant balancing act of how to get everything in that, 10-foot wide sidewalk that everybody wants. People want to have sidewalk dining. We want to have the kiosk. We want to have planters. We want to have benches. And so getting all that in that sidewalk is a constant challenge, but we'll continue to work and try to keep in mind the aisle width and those kind of, as well as those with folks that are sight impaired, and making sure we're doing things to help them navigate through not only our downtown, but our entire community.
Yeah, I just remember listening in or watching the YouTube video for that meeting, and that discussion being had during that meeting, and wanted to make sure that we didn't drop the ball, particularly this committee, on following up on any concerns that the public has around accessibility and mobility issues in our city.
I did introduce Jane and Amy, who made the presentation, to see if she could come and give the presentation to this group as well, because I know it was brought up in our meeting that this really falls under DEI.
Yeah.
So hopefully she'll be able to come and give you all that same presentation soon. So maybe that might help this group generate some more ideas and like how you could get involved in that process. Because she has a lot of really good insights as far from an accessibility standpoint. And even when her and I met to first talk about it, we were sitting at Black Bear outside and somebody came by in a wheelchair, and the metal chairs from our outdoor tables, they had all gotten moved around. And so this older woman had to keep moving all these chairs around. So whoever she was with, it was in the wheelchair, could get through. And it was just, it was right in front of us as we were sitting there talking about it. So I'm glad that we're kind of bringing it to this group's attention, and hopefully we can keep moving it forward.
Thank you.
Move on to other business, starting with the Black History Month.
So just a quick update. I know Melinda, I think got an email from us and maybe some other folks. Just to let you know, so Black History Month is quickly almost upon us. And this year, and Allison can correct anything I get wrong, or this is her thing. That we're working on really focusing on African-American, Black businesses historically and current, and really focusing on those in our community to recognize things that are currently here and things that may have no longer been here. So Miss Aisha, who is Bahia's mother, who grew up in the community, gave us a big list of African-American owned businesses that are no longer here that, you know, obviously I had no knowledge of, and it was kind of neat. And I think Ronnie Pepper's also helping us, and I'm sure we'll get others and those kind of things. Allison, you want to add anything to that, or?
I have a list of 41.
Okay,
And I told Allison that I would give her, we'll go around and get the addresses, and I've talked with some individuals about getting pictures and things.
But
Yeah,
Melinda
a
called
quick
to ask
question about
what
that.
order we were posting things,
Yeah.
and I said I didn't know yet, because we still got to gather everything, and then we'll see what all comes in based on our community partners that are trying to pull everything together, and then we'll just see what we have and then decide whether it'll be a post a day or how we want to organize the businesses that are mentioned. So feel free to submit additional ideas to me, even from the greater committee. I'm hoping to have submissions by the end of next week so that we can have a little bit of time before we get to February to put everything together. But thanks for all the help everybody's given so far.
Well, that pretty much answers my question. 'Cause I
Okay.
was gonna ask about the current businesses and the new ones. Because there are several, there is a list that was provided for by another individual.
Yeah.
Of current businesses. So would that be a part of this as well? or-
so I think what we're trying to Allison, help me. I think what we're trying to focus on is really historical
Okay.
businesses at this point. We're trying to be, we as a city, and Allison, correct anything, and you want to, I'll let you.
We were trying to focus on more historic businesses, locations, churches, organizations. Only because we're trying to walk a fine line between promoting one business over another on our government channels. So that was the direction we're heading. But I guess as we see what comes in, we can check it out. But that's more that's the danger. We don't want to cross our policy lines in terms of the city endorsing a specific business
We
over another business.
We
But
try, in everything we do, we don't want to be come across that we are endorsing one business or one entity over another, because we're all related to the city. So, right, we want to share. So we're trying to stay more historical and non-commercialized businesses, especially like we will do some churches and things like that.
John, when I spoke to Allison, I noticed in the email, it said within the city limits, especially churches. But as I was telling her, Shaw's Creek and Mud Creek Missionary, I think there should be some mention, even though they're in the county, because some of the, especially the African and Methodist Episcopal churches came out of Shaw's Creek. So.
Okay.
And Mud Creek Missionary, the Baptist churches, because most of the churches were in locations that was accessible to the people. And, if you in a horse-drawn buggy, you can't, it take you quite a bit of time to come from the city of Hendersonville to go to Etowah.
Yeah.
or Flat Rock.
Yeah.
So would it be possible to mention just those two, since they were over, so I think my church is like 137 years, so Shaw Creek would be way, and Mud Creek be way.
Okay. I mean, I know we have information. We'll be happy to do that. I know we have information on Mud Creek. I'm less familiar with Shaw Creek, so any information. I don't know if you have anything on Shaw Creek or if it's in in our book.
And there's a historical marker
There is a section in the book.
on
too.
64.
Okay, so as long as we can get the information, we'll be happy to share that. And then finally, under other business, Mr. Vice Chairman, just remind people of the Martin Luther King Jr. Unity Breakfast, which is Monday. And you can get tickets at the Community Foundation, correct? I don't believe they're sold out at this point. And so, and you can get, if there are opportunities to get tickets at the door if they're not sold out. So just remind everybody that's Monday. And Belinda, anything else you want to add to that?
And if you can't get them at Community Foundation, contact myself or Ronnie Pepper or Shirley Davidson. We would have access to those tickets, but there will be tickets at the door because it's always been that way.
Okay.
What is the time of the breakfast?
Breakfast, usually tell people to get there by 8. Because the speaker will start speaking around 9:15 at the latest. And they serve a line, so. that community college.
And I think Allison had one more thing. So
Yeah, downtown Hendersonville is listening in. So Jamie Carpenter did point out that if they are downtown businesses within the municipal service districts, 7th Avenue District or Main Street District, downtown may have some more flexibility with promoting current businesses as well that are within their district. So there may be some flexibility there. So as businesses come in, I can share those with Jamie too.
great. That's great. Thank you, Jamie. Yes.
And
'Cause-
also after the MLK breakfast, St. James Church, we do the serve rice and beans for the storehouse. We package rice and beans. So you're welcome to come up there and package rice and beans. They have cookies that usually cook the children, bake the cookies, and sometimes they take them down to the mission. They even serve lunch there. But we will need volunteers for the rice and beans. Take to the storehouse. That's at 1:00. The day of serving is what it's called.
That's all I have, Mr. Vice Chairman.
Okay, well, I would like to take the time to adjourn the meeting, and again, thank you all for coming.
Good evening.
Good evening.